I suppose I could just go down to the United States and start working with American counterparts to see if we can build more pipelines.
That Albertans can go to Washington, D.C., meet with senior officials at the highest level of the U.S. administration, and there's more support for a West Coast pipeline from Alberta in Washington, D.C. than there is in Ottawa.
We are making a very, very strong case that building a new pipeline to Asian markets is in the national interest. I would say if we're going to get a deal, it will be in a matter of weeks.
Alberta oil from Alberta down to Nebraska and beyond and into Texas, and allowing the United States to have a larger share.
Canada explodes as Alberta just announced major new U.S. pipeline deal. Alberta has just confirmed a massive new U.S. pipeline corridor, and it blows apart the illusion of who really controls energy in Canada. Done quietly and without Ottawa's blessing, it pushes roughly 1 million barrels a day onto a route the federal government can no longer delay, stall, or bury in process. By locking in its biggest and most powerful customer, Alberta secures demand, pricing power, and leverage in one move, and the shockwave is brutal because it instantly shifts Canada's economic gravity, federal authority, and the national unity fight itself.
Beneath our feet here in Alberta, we stand on oil reserves valued at over $9 trillion. What stands before us right now is a once-in-a-generation opportunity to unlock our wealth of resources and become a world-leading energy superpower.
Main part, this did not happen by accident. Alberta spent months driving this deal in silence because hard experience taught a brutal lesson. In Canada, visibility suffocates momentum. While Ottawa drowned itself in consultations and press rituals, Alberta moved with discipline, cycling drafts, shaping terms, locking direction, lining up power long before the federal system sensed a threat.
Third or fourth biggest oil producer in the world. It has the potential over the next decade to add 1 million barrels to that. We already produce roughly about 5 million.
That silence became the weapon. When the deal finally surfaced, it landed like an ambush because the substance already existed. Momentum was real, commitments were active, movement was underway. This was execution revealing itself, not permission being requested.
This is a test of whether Canada works as a country. Because if we can't build with collaboration of the federal government and between provinces, if it's everybody gets to get their products going to market except Alberta, that's not a country.
And that is why Ottawa is rattled. The federal government has operated for years on the belief that nothing major moves without its consent. Alberta proved that assumption only holds when provinces choose to wait. This project was structured to stay inside provincial jurisdiction, bypass federal choke points, and remove the usual levers of delay. Once that happened, control didn't disappear through legislation. It disappeared through irrelevance.
And although I am not blind to the fact that the people of Alberta have had the rug pulled out from underneath them too many times to count over the past 10 years, I also know that a new relationship and a new beginning needs a starting point grounded in good faith.
This corridor works because it plugs Alberta straight into the biggest energy machine on the planet. The United States burns roughly 20 million barrels a day, produces closer to 13 million, and runs a structural shortfall that never sleeps. That gap pulls barrels like gravity. Alberta's crude fits U.S. refineries by design, and once those barrels enter the American network, they move because markets demand them, not because committees allow them.
We have the most abundant and accessible natural resources of any country on Earth, and yet we landlocked them. Sell what we do produce to a single customer to the south of us while enabling polluting dictatorships to eat our lunch. For Albertans, these attacks on our province by our own federal government have become unbearable.
The scale is the shock. A corridor built around 1 million barrels a day instantly reshapes pricing dynamics. Transportation discounts compress. Planning certainty returns. Producers stop guessing and start committing. At current prices hovering around $70 per barrel, that volume alone generates roughly $25 billion annually in raw value before refining.
The energy sector is one of the only industries in Canada that is growing.
95% of the country's oil is produced here in Western Canada. It's home to Alberta's oil sands, where producers pump out millions of barrels of thick, tar-like oil every day. But most of that oil ends up just across the border, mainly in the Midwest, instead of other global markets.
For context, Alberta's entire provincial budget runs about $73 billion, meaning this single corridor moves the equivalent of 1/3 of total government spending every year. This is why buyers sign long-term commitments. This is why capital shows up early. This is why momentum accelerates.
Smith praising the fact that the vast majority of Alberta goods sold to the U.S., such as oil, gas, and agricultural products, remain tariff-free.
And the insulation is ruthless. Barrels inside the U.S. system sit beyond coastal bans, beyond federal pauses, beyond last-minute veto politics. Past projects died at choke points before flow ever began. This route chooses a grid where flow continues by default.
One of the kind of failed projects in the history of pipelines that failed, Energy East, Northern Gateway.
Canada burned a decade standing still, and Alberta paid the bill. 3 nation-scale pipelines died in sequence: Northern Gateway, Energy East, Keystone XL. The loss compounds every single year. Together, those projects represented roughly 2.5 million barrels per day of stranded capacity and about $55 billion annually in erased economic value.
Their production, if they face an emissions cap, which would force them to shut in. No one is going to expand if we have really aggressive and expensive carbon taxes that are being implemented by 2030.
For Alberta alone, that translated into around $17 billion a year that never reached public services, infrastructure, or workers. Keystone by itself wiped out over $1.3 billion in direct taxpayer losses before counting the downstream damage.
There's quite a bit of law internationally that says that if you are a separate nation, one nation cannot landlock another. It's sort of a given that it is inappropriate use of power to prevent a jurisdiction from being able to get its resources to market.
This created a contradiction that became impossible to carry. Alberta's oil faced rejection while Alberta's revenue remained essential. Equalization flowed. Federal programs expanded. Market access stayed locked. Towns stalled. Investment fled. Separatist sentiment climbed to levels provincial leaders openly describe as the highest they have ever seen. That is where the break happened. Alberta reached the conclusion that consensus had turned into a trap. When every project requires approval from regions that produce nothing, nothing ever moves. So Alberta shifted strategy from persuasion to execution. Delay carried a measurable price. Action became the only rational option.
Free to develop and export that incredible wealth of resources we have for the benefit of our families and future generations. Free to pursue opportunities with the ideals of entrepreneurship, hard work, and innovation.
Every pipeline that failed before this one collapsed at the same fault line. Ownership. Communities were asked to tolerate projects they did not control, and resistance followed every time. Alberta tore that model apart. This corridor is built on equity, not consultation theater. Indigenous partners are brought in as owners from day one, with financing structures that turn participation into power.
We have a government that's planning our demise, and it's very hard to disregard the fact that our GDP has grown 1.5% in 10 years. How is that possible?
Through the Alberta Indigenous Opportunities Corporation, the province can underwrite up to $3 billion in loan guarantees. That mechanism has already supported 7 major projects worth over $8.5 billion in total investment and delivered direct economic participation to 43 of Alberta's 44 First Nations. The Cascade Power Project alone brought in $83 million in Indigenous equity. The Access Pipeline expansion involved $400 million in Indigenous investment. This is not symbolism. Equity means voting rights. Equity means revenue streams. Equity means timelines matter to everyone involved. The result is structural stability. Lawsuits lose their incentive. Blockades lose their logic. Projects stop dying in courtrooms and start surviving in reality.
New major projects, unless the federal government overturns or overhauls its Trudeau-era anti-resource development policies. And that includes the oil and gas emissions cap, which we know is a production cap, Bill C-69, the No More Pipelines law, and the tanker ban, which have made investment in new oil and gas projects extremely difficult.
Ownership converts opposition into enforcement because people protect what they own. That single change is lethal to delay culture. Federal approvals expire. Election cycles flip. Courts drag on. Ownership endures. Alberta tied this corridor to a fixed timeline that detonated inside federal politics. The application window points to June. The approval window narrows toward fall. October introduces a referendum threat that converts delay into political cost. Time is no longer neutral. Each pause increases exposure.
We all know Canada's economy is suffering right now. We've had an inflation crisis, high unemployment, declining GDP, capital investment fleeing Canada for other countries, massive federal deficits, and of course, the U.S. tariff threat, which has exposed just how dependent we are on one single country for the vast majority of our exports.
Mark Carney entered office promising speed during an economic slowdown marked by weak growth, capital flight, trade vulnerability, and rising debt. This file tests that promise in public. Alberta reduced the choice to two outcomes: act quickly or absorb province-wide political escalation. Every delay strengthens separatist momentum already described by provincial leaders as historically elevated. The pressure comes from timing combined with market risk. Heavy crude prices remain volatile. Venezuelan supply competes for the same buyers. U.S. control over export flows continues to tighten. Lost access does not return automatically. Alberta forced those constraints into a decision window measured in weeks.
Way would be south. The U.S. president has said that he wants to have a reboot of the Keystone XL pipeline, so we know that he's interested in seeing more energy come down.
Ottawa no longer sets the pace. It reacts under a countdown defined outside the capital. Alberta removed the shelter of delay and replaced it with a clock. In politics, timing determines outcomes. Alberta took control of the timing. Canada's energy map tells an ugly truth. Almost every major line points south, and a single coastal outlet carries the entire burden of global access. Trans Mountain handles roughly 890,000 barrels per day to the Pacific, while southbound pipelines like Enbridge Mainline move over 3 million barrels daily into the United States.
We agree that the Trans Mountain pipeline needs to be optimized, another 360,000 barrels. We agree in the development of LNG exports, LISMs, and LNG Canada 1 and 2.
That imbalance concentrates risk and hands leverage to whoever controls the buyer side. The United States accounts for about 77% of Canada's trade, worth over $780 billion annually, while China sits near 4% at just $31 billion. When access funnels through one customer, pricing power erodes and shocks travel fast. A corridor capable of moving 1 million barrels a day changes that calculus by stabilizing flow today and strengthening leverage for diversification tomorrow.
On a per-person basis, our endowment of natural resources far exceeds China, Europe, Russia, and even the United States. And it's not particularly close. We have incredibly fertile lands and oceans, unmatched supplies of timber, uranium, and potash, and a treasure trove of critical minerals in every province and territory.
This move does not stay contained inside Alberta. The moment one province proves it can secure market access at scale, the model stops being theoretical. Saskatchewan and Manitoba see the same math, the same bottlenecks, and the same risk of being trapped behind politics while markets move on. When one route works, others copy it.
But I think he's been very positive about the idea of having an economic corridor and have all types of projects in there, including pipelines.
Provinces that produce resources but lack exits face a simple choice: keep pleading inside a system that stalls, or integrate directly into demand where movement is rewarded. Alberta just demonstrated the second path that forces a recalculation across the prairies, because capital follows routes that function, not promises that expire. Westbound pipelines died because politics controlled geography. Every route toward the coast ran into layered resistance, shifting rules, and veto points that multiplied the moment steel appeared on a map. Projects stalled, courts dragged, timelines collapsed. Southbound worked because markets outrank ideology. Demand sits concentrated, infrastructure already exists, and buyers care about supply security, not domestic political theater. The route aligns with how energy actually moves, through consumption hubs, refining capacity, and logistics that reward flow instead of punishing it. Alberta stopped forcing energy through hostile terrain and followed gravity instead. Separatist sentiment did not rise out of ideology, it rose out of blockage. Alberta carried revenue, funded the system, and watched access get shut down again and again. That friction built pressure year after year until patience ran out. This corridor attacks the pressure pressure point directly. Market access restores agency. When producers can sell, plan, and invest, economic anger cools. Control over exits matters more than speeches about unity. Alberta's move reframes the debate from grievance to leverage, and that shift matters politically.
Well, you have to understand just how damaged Alberta is by the fact that we didn't get pipelines built. If we had built Northern Gateway, if we'd built Keystone and we'd built Energy East, we'd have 2.5 million barrels more per day of production, which is $55 billion a year worth.
The risk now sits with Ottawa. If access holds, separatist energy bleeds off. If delays reappear, pressure spikes harder than before. Alberta did not escalate rhetorically. It changed the conditions, and conditions decide movements. This corridor redraws who actually carries weight inside Canada. For years, rules flowed from the center, while revenue flowed from the regions. Alberta just inverted that balance. When a province controls scale, access, and demand, it stops being a policy subject and starts being an economic anchor.
It is such an important day for the energy sector of this country. There have been, I know naysayers, and there's no better way to put that to rest and to say, look around you. This is being built.
Federal influence weakens when it loses the ability to throttle outcomes, and this move stripped that leverage in one stroke. Alberta did not ask to renegotiate the federation. It changed the terms by moving first. This is the reset few were prepared for. A country built on delay cannot dominate a region built on output. From this point forward, economic gravity tilts toward whoever delivers value at scale, and Alberta just made its position impossible to ignore.
We've got 700,000 barrels a day that make it to the Gulf Coast, and then we've got a potential for 1.2 million that goes to Trans Mountain. We could sign deals with European refineries, with Indian refineries. We could actually redirect those purchases somewhere else, and that would solve our trade deficit.
But here's the question Ottawa can no longer avoid. If one province can bypass federal authority, secure its own market access, and lock in billions in annual revenue without permission, what happens when the others follow? Saskatchewan produces 600,000 barrels a day. Manitoba ships 15% of Canada's agricultural exports. British Columbia controls access to Asia. Each one now watches Alberta prove that waiting for consensus means waiting forever. Canada just discovered that federations don't fracture from separation votes. They fracture when regions stop asking for permission and start building their own exits. The corridor Alberta just opened isn't just a pipeline, it's a blueprint, and blueprints spread faster than policies ever could. If this breakdown helped you see what's really happening beneath the headlines, hit like and subscribe and share the video.